the main question that I wanted to ask in this talk is, who benefits from the green city? Who has the right, in a way, to live in a green and healthy city? And so that's a little bit of the work that underpins our research and our interests in my university, my lab. My focus is in, or let's say my background is in urban planning, with also a training in sociology and political ecology. I was trained in the US, came back to Europe a few years ago, and so I also try to bring in these diverse academic environments to my research, and the lab that James Connolly and myself co-direct in Barcelona is a lab on environmental justice and sustainability, and the students and the postdocs we have very much bring this comparative urbanism lens to it. So yes, the main question I wanted to raise today is, can green cities be healthy and just? I think it's very important because of the intersection of urban planning and public health. If we look at existing research in epidemiology, the main trends talk about the health benefits of urban green spaces. For instance, research by Gascon and other co-authors estimates that the risk of cardiovascular disease mortality is 4% lower, and the mortality of all causes is 8% lower for residents who are exposed to green space in their place of residence. However, what a lot of this public health research does not take into consideration is the question of health inequity. The definition of health inequity is a difference or a disparity in health outcomes that is systematic, avoidable, and unjust. And I think that's very important because of the common calls that you see in public health agencies, in UN agencies as well, for delivering green space, for delivering places that are more livable, ecologically sustainable in cities, but at the same time doing it for all residents. And the lack, I would say, of emphasis on studying who in the end benefits from green cities. If you take studies that have been conducted, especially in the United States, on health inequities and green space, you will see the following. 2 in 3 kids in Los Angeles County do not live within walking distance to a park, which is considered a distance of 400 meters. If you also look at the division of who has access to green space in Los Angeles, you can see that white kids have access on average to 95.7 acres of green space against only 2.9% for black kids or 5% for Latino kids. So you can very much see the unequal access to green space by race, by class, by ethnicity. And it's not just a question of size of green space, it's also a question of quality of green space, density, maintained green space, and also a question of what's called interactional justice, meaning what green space provide, the resources, the needs, and the types of identities that lower-income residents or minority groups are seeking when they go to a green space. Does it have to be this beautiful, pristine green space that so many cities are creating, or can it also be a green space that fulfills the needs of minority residents? And I think that's a question that's very important in the context of many cities having these very big flagship projects, these mega projects around green infrastructure. This is the equivalent of our High Line in Barcelona, you know, the High Line project in New York, a formerly elevated railway station and railway tracks transformed into a longitudinal park. It's called the Jardins de la Rambla de Sants and was inaugurated in August 2016. And so the main question that planners actually are looking at now is, who will be living in this area 10 years down the road? Are we going to keep seeing the working class and a very diverse, socially diverse group of residents that we are seeing now in the neighborhood called Sants, or will we see this type of real estate developments? This is one of the latest real estate developments put up by Zaha Hadid Studio. Is being inaugurated right now, and the penthouse on the top of the building is going to cost $50 million. So again, ecological utopias, ecological enclaves at the end, or are we talking about newly ecological spaces for everyone in the city? So if we change a little bit the question I was posing at the beginning into an academic question, the question I wanted to look at more in depth now through 3 case examples is a question around to what extent does urban greening positively redistribute access to green amenities in the city? The main argument here is that green amenities in the form of parks, playgrounds, community gardens, even greenways, seem to increasingly create conditions for the social spatial exclusion and invisibilization of the most socially and racially vulnerable residents in cities. But not only the residents themselves, their uses of nature, their livelihoods, and their practices. Which then brings me to the argument that many of these spaces are becoming green Lulus, or perceived as green Lulus. In the planning literature, you might know that a Lulu, a locally unwanted land use, generally refers to a toxic waste site, a contaminating industry, a waste transfer station. Here the argument, the provocative argument I'm making is that actually a lot of these sites are becoming green locally unwanted land uses because of the tensions of displacement and exclusion that they are creating. And this is particularly important in the context of the environmental justice movement and the environmental justice literature. Up to a few years ago, it was pretty straightforward for residents and lower income and minority residents and organizations around them to ask for and fight for increased amount of green space, fresh food, recreational resources, restored waterways, etc., looking at both physical and mental health benefits of these projects. In the book that I published a few years ago, I made the argument that those projects helped neighborhoods address so-called blight or address discrimination, address abandonment, and create places of safe havens against environmental traumas that a lot of those neighborhoods had faced. However, now many of those groups are facing this green space paradox, or this paradox where urban greening becomes a form of new green gap in a way. Neil Smith would talk about the rent gap. Here we can talk about a green gap, in the sense that many spaces that were formerly called wasted spaces, marginal land, unused areas, vacant lots, are now being converted in a new practice of urban development into those spaces where public officials and private investors come together to capitalize rent and at the same time create new forms of ecological enclaves and real estate developments that only benefit upper income residents. So in a way, my question is this model that I tried to argue for a few years ago still valid in the context of urban greening today, especially the more visible forms of urban greening? If we think about the literature itself, the literature on green gentrification is obviously based in the gentrification literature, which looks at the same time at the cultural, social changes, demographic changes, and real estate transformations that neighborhoods that were previously, let's say, marked as a red dot or redlined in a particular city now are being transformed, are being rebranded into these creative multicultural neighborhoods that attract upper income and wider residents. Here, what we are noticing is that new urban environmental transformations and improvements are intertwined with inequity reformation and gentrification. With what I was saying earlier is that contaminated or vacant land creates a new form of green gap. And as Elizabeth was saying earlier, what we definitely see more and more, especially through literature in real estate economics, is that housing that are in proximity to green space, especially newly created or restored green space, are drastically more valuable from a real estate standpoint than those that are in less than close proximity to a green space. And there are more and more studies on that. From a definitional standpoint itself, Sarah Dooling in 2009 defined environmental gentrification in the following way. It is the implementation of an environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that leads to the displacement or exclusion of the most vulnerable, economically vulnerable population while espousing an environmental ethic. And the word environmental ethic is particularly important because, again, urban greening is sold as this new mantra or as this new planning orthodoxy that many cities around the world are adopting. And so the question is, how do we create co-benefits of urban greening so that, again, not only the most socially vulnerable residents, but even the middle class, if you think about cities like London or Paris, can also benefit from green spaces. I'm going to talk very briefly about 3 examples of green gentrification across the global north and south. The first one is New Orleans. I'm not going to talk about Katrina. I'm going to talk about the plan to take down this highway that you see on the left image, which is called I-10. It's Clairborne Avenue. It was a highway that was built in the 1960s in the US, as many other highways were built, to basically bring back residents who had fled to the suburbs, white residents in particular, to the urban centers. And at the same time, those highways decimated, invisibilized, and scarred neighborhoods that were oftentimes lower income and minority neighborhoods. Here we are talking about Treme, which is a largely black neighborhood of New Orleans, which now is supposed to be transformed into a neighborhood for the creative class, a neighborhood whose economic potential would be enhanced, according to a planning commission that is planning to transform the I-10 highway into the greenway that you see on the right here. And so 60 years ago, we had plenty of green spaces in cities, especially what you could see. That was Clairborne Avenue in the 1950s, then Clairborne Avenue now, and then Clairborne Avenue in 2020. What is important here to think about or to reflect on is that the vocabulary of this planning commission and the designers are absolutely erasing and invisibilizing the landscapes of Clairborne Avenue that were being reoccupied, reused, and recreated by black residents. As I showed in these pictures, this is some of the street art that is taking place under the highway itself. There are jazz funerals, there are marches, there are parades around the highway. So it's not a blighted neighborhood, unlike what this planning commission is saying or is articulating in order to justify the purpose of this green space. The problem is that at the end of the day, neighborhoods like Clairborne raise following questions. Are walkable neighborhoods and bike lanes only for the creative class? What we see in the case of Clairborne Avenue is the remaking of a city with greater access to green space and culture for privileged residents to the detriment of the right of black residents to a greener environment, secure economic opportunities, and cultural protection. Because the idea here is that obviously you would bring new white residents to Clairborne Avenue, which would raise property prices and then outprice lower-income minorities. In that case, streets and green spaces have symbolic social and cultural functions which are getting reimagined only for a few. And we are seeing again and again through this green planning of Clairborne Avenue the same types of planning interventions that have created the social-spatial inequities that we are trying to address in the planning profession as well, at least on paper, and also as academics. The second example is in Medellin, Colombia. As you might know, the Urban Land Institute voted Medellin the most innovative city in the world in 2016. And Medellin has been branding itself as a resilient, smart, and also livable city for the past 20 years since the government of Pablo Fajardo and his social urbanism practices. The project here that I'm studying is called the Green Belt of Medellin, which is a 74 square kilometer green belt on the slopes of the Aburra Valley, where actually the majority of lower-income residents are living. They are living in what are called the comunas, like these informal settlements that residents built in the context of the civil war that ravaged Colombia for 3 decades, and where residents flew because that was the only place they could live. Now the idea is having this green belt and basically delocalize a lot of the residents that are living on the slopes. The goal of the green belt on paper is to manage climate risks, control growth, and also enhance access to green space to residents of the city. It's a very hard infrastructure, if you will, that encircles the city at the moment. What we are seeing, however, in terms of planning inequities are the fact that possibly 180,000 residents will be impacted by the green belt because they are living above the 1,600-meter line where residents are not allowed anymore to be living. The problem is that residents from lower income backgrounds seem to be unable or unallowed to stay, while residents who have built or developers who have built gated communities are allowed to remain. And we're talking about areas that have been considered by the city at high risk of landslides. But some get to stay, some do not get to stay. There are also controversies over which risk areas are considered recoverable or non-recoverable, in the sense that which areas can be rehabilitated or not. And according to the city, there are a lot of, well, the city is overestimating the number of these non-recoverable areas, whereas local universities and residents are saying this is not as high. But this political and social interpretation of risk, and even, or some would say, manipulation of risk, is creating pretext, you could say, for the selective displacement of people. What we're also seeing is that behind the green belt is a support to the military and growth construction machine that has also characterized Medellin. So within the green belt itself, there is a new military base that has been built, even though it's illegal to have this base. But it is a form of social spatial control of low-income residents. So you could say that this green belt is disciplining both the landscapes but also the behaviors of lower-income residents living there. And the green belt is also criticized for its lack of meaningful community engagement, in that sense betraying the tradition of social urbanism that characterized the city, and I'm not going to expand on that part. Second, the green space that, let's say, is being emphasized or is being valued or is being recreated around Medellin is also a form of enclosed, privatized, and exploited landscape. Why? Because most of the infrastructure that has been built is actually gray infrastructure. We're not talking here about using indigenous trails that residents had built or the ecological knowledge about, let's say, plants and trees that are less prone to erosion. We're talking here about constructing the 74 square kilometers of hard walls with 10-meter deep foundations with structures and hard machinery that come and decimate the territories of low-income residents. So it's not this green infrastructure incorporating, let's say, lightweight ecological principles. It's very much a manicured, built-up nature for, let's say, a new creative class of Medellin. We're talking here about new landscapes of privilege and pleasure, and at the same time, the invisibilization of residents' relationship to nature. What's very important here as well, and I don't know if I have a picture, yes, is that a lot of the urban gardens that residents had built are also being erased, and residents are being moved to tower-type public housing on the other side of the city. So there is a profound loss of access to land, to resources, to jobs, to networks. But the city still is promoting urban agriculture in a very specific way. It has a few parcels of formalized urban agriculture at the bottom part of the green belt, where it showcases some of the, let's say, agricultural practice of residents, except that the food is not sold within the informal settlement itself, but within the most exclusive markets of the city where the white middle class and upper class of Medellin is living. So again, there's a strong invisibilization of residents' practices. So if you want to think about some words of conclusion here for this case, what we can see is that the containment and beautification of these landscapes and the greening of these landscapes takes place through a form of land grabbing that is transforming those landscapes into landscapes of pleasure and privilege for a few. Yes, the city is advocating the greatest public good and these projects being built for all residents, but you can see that there is a social and racial stratification of who in the end has access to these landscapes, who feels that they own or not these landscapes and is being welcomed in those landscapes. And in that particular case, green gentrification does not manifest, or at least does not manifest yet, through the replacement of residents by upper income residents, but just by a form of greenery that appeals to the consuming taste of the upper class of Medellin who comes and enjoy this green space. And then finally, very briefly, our new project, which is on green gentrification in 40 cities in the United States, Europe, and Canada. I'm just going to talk very briefly about a pilot study of Barcelona we finished. The project is called Green Lulus, and the project asks the following question. Do new green spaces provide amenities for marginalized residents, or do they contribute to their displacement? Our idea in this project is not to look only at case by case of real estate and demographic impact of green space creation in the city, but to look also at the flows of residents and at the impact of a large-scale green space creation in this social and demographic dynamics. So what did we do? We mapped 18 green spaces that were built in the city since 1990, especially those in the more, let's say, socially vulnerable neighborhoods. I can talk about the design in another moment. And what we did was to look at the changes in demographic and real estate values of buffer areas around those parks in comparison with the district as a whole, as a control measure, if you will. We use both OLS regression techniques and geographically weighted regressions technique to really better understand the extent to which distance to a green space predict changes in demographic and real estate outcomes in the direction of green gentrification. We created green gentrification scores in the city, and basically what did we realize is that the areas that are closer to the waterfront in the, let's say, southern part of the city, and those that are also closer to the center part of the city have seen green gentrification occur to a moderate to strong extent. However, those areas that you see that are more in the northern part of the city have not experienced green gentrification. So in a way, the picture is quite good, and you could say that actually we need to have a very nuanced understanding of how gentrification works in a city. However, what we also realize is that the impact of gentrification very much depends on the housing stock of the potential of neighborhoods to be rebranded into neighborhoods that offer technology, square opportunities, or opportunities for the creative class, those that have a morphology or an architecture that might be appealing for developers, and those also that might be more connected to the city center, which is why, in that particular case, those neighborhoods, let's say, with the white circles are not being gentrified, because they have an architecture stock that is associated with the late dictatorship housing structures of Franco. They are further away from the center, and many of these spaces as well are located closer to highways. So here we need to be very, very cognizant also of what types of green spaces might actually create gentrification. Those that are closer to contaminating facilities might not, smaller ones might not as well. And those where neighborhoods are not able to be rebranded might also not create gentrification. And the final words I will say is that it's important here also to understand the flows of populations. Why? Because what we notice is that those areas in white have seen an increase in the proportion of lower income residents, residents from the global south, lower educated residents. So you could say that's fantastic, because at the end of the day, those residents have access to green space. However, we also see a form of polarization and resegregation, because those residents tend to live in neighborhoods where the housing stock, again, is of lower quality, jobs are much, let's say, the percentage of unemployment is much higher, and the access to public equipment and infrastructure is also much lower. So there is a form also of resegregation in the city, and green space is not everything, is improving the quality of life of residents. So that's all I want to conclude on, and just leave you with this final image of Barcelona, which is one of our latest projects in the city, the creation of the superblocks, which are blocks of 3x3, where traffic within the blocks, within the 3x3 blocks, would be reduced to a very minimum, and public spaces and green spaces would be created again. And so one of the main questions that now the City Council has on its mind is, how do we create superblocks without creating new islands of gentrification and real estate speculation? And that's not a question that's easy to address in a very hot real estate market like Barcelona, in a place where tourism massification is also very much contributing to gentrification. So thank you.